right. Good afternoon. Well, just barely afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for a few more people to come in, and I'll open the waiting room or keep the waiting room open. Awesome. Okay. Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to today's program, The Restorative Impact of Perceived Open Space with Jeff Northridge from Sky Factory. I'm Margaret Stella with AIA Baltimore and the BAF. I would like to introduce our presenter. Jeff Northridge has an extensive experience in both commercial real estate and the commercial construction industry. For the past 8 years, he has been with Sky Factory developing and presenting continuing education courses on topics including the effect of biophilic design elements on human physiology and how biophilic illusions can be created to provide many of the same physiological benefits as actual biophilic design elements, and how knowledge of the mechanics of human perception can be paired with carefully crafted illusions of nature to alter how humans experience interior spaces. During this time, he has presented Sky Factory's various AIA-approved continuing education courses more than 400 times to architectural and design firms, as well as to AIA chapter meetings and other events. Mr. Northridge is an active member of Kiwanis International and has served on the Kiwanis National Speakers Bureau for their Eliminate Project, an international initiative dedicated to raising $110 million for the elimination of maternal and neonatal tetanus worldwide. For this lecture today, please be sure to add your questions to the chat box, and as they come in, I will read them all at the end. And please fill out the form that I will send in just a moment to receive any continuing education credit. This session is being recorded, and with that, I'm going to pass it off to Jeff and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Margaret. Boy, what a great introduction. I think my head is a little bit swollen. So again, thank you. And first thing I'd like to do is just say how much I appreciate your joining in today. Very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys. So again, welcome to our course, The Restorative Impact of Perceived Open Space. The course is AIA approved for one HSW learning unit. You wouldn't be here, obviously, if it wasn't. The course is also IDCEC approved. So if we have any interior designers joining in, you can also get credit. We do have a sign-in sheet that you can use, or you can use Margaret's. Either one works. Ours does have some evaluation questions at the end and an opportunity to provide comments. I think Margaret can provide you the link to that if you're interested. The course is also approved by the IDCEC for general education credit. If you're a lead professional or a member of the U.S. Green Building Council, you can get that credit. You will need to self-report your attendance. We will provide you all with certificates of completion that you can use to report that credit. This course is copyrighted, so don't tell anyone anything about what I'm going to say or we'll have to sue you. I'm just kidding. We actually encourage you to share this information with clients as well as colleagues, anybody really who you think may find it interesting. This is the course description, which hopefully you read when you decided to join in today. I am not going to read it again. There's actually very few things that I enjoy less than listening to someone read something from a screen. So not going to go there today. A few comments, though, about the course. The course is very informationally dense, as I like to put it, and I will be speaking for almost the full hour. Please do feel free to type in any questions into the chat box, and we will address those at the end. These are the learning objectives. Again, I am not going to read through them today. Just a few comments about the context of the course, and then we'll get into it. I'm going to be talking a lot about deep plan buildings, which are simply buildings with very large floor plates, such that a great deal of the interior space is located more than about 3 times as far from an exterior wall as the floor to ceiling height. Once you get that far into a building, even without partition walls, natural light has dropped off to the point where it really doesn't contribute anything. These kinds of very large buildings comprise only about 2% of the total number of commercial buildings in the US, but that's still about 100,000 total buildings. And collectively, they represent more than 1/3 of all the commercial floor stock in the country. And as our population continues to grow, and as our cities continue to grow, there's an ever increasing demand for bigger and bigger buildings. So it's not likely that the form of the deep plan building with its associated deficiencies is going to go away anytime soon. Okay, let's dive into the course. To start, we need to take a brief look at the physiology of the human visual system. Standard vision in the human eye consists of three basic functions: object recognition, color vision, and motion detection. Light that enters our eyes is processed by specialized light-sensitive neurons in the back of the eye in the retina, called cones, which are responsible for color vision when light levels are high. We also have something called rods, which are responsible for monochromatic night vision when light levels are low. Up until 2002, these were the only known photoreceptors in the human eye: the red, green, and blue cones, plus the rods. But science recently uncovered another unique sensory apparatus that's responsible for regulating biological rhythms. It turns out there's a fifth type of photoreceptor in the inner retina with a peak sensitivity to blue light, although of a slightly different wavelength than that of the cones and the rods. These photoreceptors contain a photopigment called melanopsin, and they are known as intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. You may want to write that down for the exam. Just kidding. No exam today. That is kind of a mouthful, though. So from here on out, for the rest of the course, I'll be referring to them as either circadian photoreceptors or maybe just circadian cells. Due to their particular sensitivity to this wavelength of light, these photoreceptors are called our physiology's blue sky detector. These circadian photoreceptors signal something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, which is located in the hypothalamus area of the brain and is known to be the body's master circadian clock. And this is something which they've always done in the environmental context of wide open space. This master biological clock, the SCN, regulates how all the cells in our bodies adjust their physiology and their metabolism according to the time of day. But it remains to be seen whether the brain's master clock will operate the same way in the absence of a visual connection to a natural exterior space. At this time, nobody really knows for certain. Up until now, these circadian photoreceptors have been thought to only be concerned with irradiance, that is, overall retinal light exposure. It is not thought that they play any kind of a role in visual image formation. That's the job of the cones and the rods. However, new research published in the Journal of Current Biology just this year emphasizes that the cone photoreceptors, which have not thought to be relevant in signaling our circadian brain centers, are more than 1,000 times more sensitive to light than melanopsin, which suggests that lighting intensity is not the only way to regulate circadian entrainment. The cones are exquisitely attuned to long wavelength oranges and yellows, the colors most vividly on display at sunrise and sunset. Furthermore, the cone photoreceptors are very receptive to contrasting light, a phenomenon most prevalent before dawn and at twilight, which means that our circadian neural networks receive a much richer array of visual and spatial information than previously thought relevant to circadian entrainment. And while recent scientific studies tend to emphasize that the spatial distribution of light, that is, where in the visual field light may be coming from, does not appear to affect circadian phase resetting, at least not to the limited set of light patterns that have been tested so far. In view of other neural clues, it seems reasonable to assume that such data does play a valuable role. After all, the sun provides daylight within the context of a blue canopy, the sky, that is by its very nature spatial. Such an integrated view of our brain's neural connections and synaptic inputs would also appear to fit well with other key neuroscientific observations, which note that higher cognitive faculties like attention, memory, and our ability to plan all share the same neural infrastructure that our sensory and motor faculties use as we navigate shifting external environments. Many parts of our brains process more than one kind of information. Some do it sequentially, others do it concurrently. This is one of those shared areas. And while the relatively young field of these circadian photoreceptors may be years away from mapping all their functional roles, their interconnectedness with the rest of the visual system demonstrates the relevance of a holistic approach to visual phenomena. The neuroscience of visual processing has established that environmental context helps to shape cognitive perception. What I mean here by environmental context is what other things are in the visual field surrounding the particular object that I'm looking at. Studies have found that viewing the same object under different circumstances can and does influence the strength of the visual signal. So changing the environmental context of circadian light by creating a circadian effect in an enclosed interior space may well be able to trigger alertness in the physiology. However, it's equally plausible that the artificial context in which that light intensity is perceived could also trigger other less desirable cognitive or physiological reactions in those enclosed interior spaces. And that's particularly true if the source of the circadian light cannot be attributed to a familiar, natural, or biophilic source, something that provides a recognizable spatial reference frame like the sky naturally does. While the impact of man-made circadian lighting systems is currently under study, we simply want to point out that light triggers a spatial dimension in the environment that cues our perception in ways just as fundamental and just as meaningful as the circadian impact of light itself. Leading researcher Mariana Figueroa, who is program director at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute's Lighting Research Center, has noted that the visual system relies on accurate spatial correspondence between the environment and perception. The circadian system, however, simply responds to changes in overall retinal light exposure, although it seems more responsive to light from above the line of sight, which reinforces the notion that the circadian system is a blue sky detector. The above noted observation may also indicate that humankind's hardwired blue sky detection system may not be limited to just the retina, but may also involve the brain maps created by our visual system to establish spatial correspondence between the environment, that is, what's really out there, and perception, what we think is out there. Those two may not be the same, as we'll see. A blue sky does not transmit circadian light to our brain on an abstract basis. It does so as humanity's most meaningful and almost visceral, if you will, experience of open space. So perhaps, in addition to mimicking the circadian oscillations of daylight in enclosed interiors, another equally important component is the spatial context in which light is transmitted. Again, excuse me. Again, what I mean here by spatial context or environmental context, what other things are in the visual field surrounding the particular object that I'm looking at? So if not the actual sky itself, then an illusion of overhead sky or an illusion of a natural environment that's sufficiently credible to match our biophilic memory, that is, our genetic memory of the same stimuli, looking up at the sky in this case, under similar conditions, may be of significant importance. In order to understand the spatial correspondence between the environment, again, what's really out there, and perception, what we think is out there, we need to take a closer look at the relationships between light, space, and memory. Research in neuroscience has recently uncovered a fascinating connection between our ability to map space and memory, a fundamental building block involved in giving rise to environmental context. According to Jennifer Groh, who is a professor at Duke University and author of the book, Making Space: How the Brain Knows Where Things Are, it turns out that not only is memory an integral part of building a sense of space, but space in turn serves as a kind of filing system for storing and accessing memories. And the brain's memory-space connection relies on shared neural infrastructure, another one of those shared areas. This insight provides one of the clues that may answer the mystery behind why certain optical illusions, what we refer to as biophilic illusions of nature in this course, which provide a spatial reference frame, can have such a unique impact on our psychophysiology in comparison to standard or just plain representational nature photography. When we provide a visual stimulus that mimics a spatial relationship that we're familiar with, the brain's sensory and motor regions react as if the original memory itself was being re-experienced. This is consistent with a unique facet of illusions. They're capable of conjuring an experience when key cognitive cues emulate an actual past experience. This is how magicians do their tricks. While our circadian rhythm signals various internal biological clocks, given the shared neural infrastructure between memory and spatial cognition, it seems reasonable to assume that our most universal sense of space, which would be the sky, would also be an effective circadian synchronizer as it relates to the effects of daylight on our physiology. After all, our own experience confirms we intuitively gravitate to nature and open space because our senses tend to come alive, enticed in ways that no man-made environment can mimic without overstimulation or sensory overload. Research has found that open space can literally deepen human thought. Okay, we're going to shift gears a little, and moving into part 2 of the course, we're going to now take a look at what we call the hidden cost of enclosed interiors. According to the Institute for Building Efficiency, over 50% of all the commercial buildings that will still be in use by the year 2050 have already been built. In other words, a large percentage of the workforce can be expected to work in outmoded buildings for the next 30, 40, 50, or even more years. Furthermore, a 2010 survey by the US Energy Information Administration found that nearly 3/4 of the commercial floor stock in the US, equivalent to 46 billion square feet, belong to buildings over 20 years old, before the principles of biophilic design were well understood, let alone widely applied. For any of you who may not be familiar with the term biophilic design, what that means simply is bringing nature into the built space, incorporating lots of windows, skylights, atriums, natural materials and finishes, live plants where possible. This is kind of an example of biophilic design taken to the absolute maximum. Huge amounts of daylight and actual living grass carpet, as well as other live plants, bringing nature inside. It's a bit of a simplification, but that's kind of what it's all about. So these figures can only mean that while the benefits of green design, biophilic design, and sustainable technologies are more and more being incorporated into new buildings, the pressing question is, what solutions are available for billions of square feet of completely or partially enclosed interiors that will continue to be used for decades to come? How can we create sustainable interiors for long-term human occupancy in older buildings that are not optimal for human performance and health. I'd like to take a quick look at a recent study that was done in the healthcare sector related to the highest level of LEED certification, LEED Platinum. And even though this study was done in the healthcare sector, I think many of its findings are equally applicable to other market areas as well. In 2015, the Journal of Hospital Administration published an article that examined the relationship between hospital environments and employee engagement, turnover, illness, and injury. The study concluded that employees' perceptions of the interior environment do impact their engagement, health, and well-being. But the study also found that deficiencies in building design, even for LEED Platinum projects, was still very apparent. One of the criteria for achieving a LEED Platinum certification is 75% daylight penetration. And while the study found that the LEED Platinum hospitals did have a lot of daylight, it tended to be found in places like patient rooms, public corridors, cafeterias, gift shops, places where patients, their families and visitors, and the public spent time. Not so much where the hospital staff had their offices and work areas. Those tended to be found in the centers of buildings and in lower levels of multi-story buildings, and were notably devoid of daylight. The study looked at some physical differences in the layouts of the LEED Platinum facilities versus the non-LEED facilities. And it concluded by saying that future design of facilities would benefit from careful analysis of layout and organization of spaces with consideration to employee work processes. So it could be said that in this particular case anyway, that LEED has led not. Sorry, kind of a bad pun, I know. So in fact, we may find that as long as deep plan buildings continue to exist, the solution to their detrimental effect may not be found within their walls as much as within our perception of those surfaces, walls and ceilings, as spatial boundaries, our perception of those surfaces. This change in emphasis allows us to consider new visual spatial technologies within the context of existing less than ideal working environments. In order to fully understand this, we need to take a brief look at environmental design and some of the mechanics of human perception. The field of neuroscience has done much to uncover how our visual system makes inferences and fills in the gaps from missing or misleading visual input. Our brain routinely makes assumptions about sensory input, and this confirms that our perception is born of a process of interpretation, not so much the static transmission of one-to-one correlations from environmental cues. An example is this slide. When you first looked at this, some of you may have seen spirals, others may have seen overlapping or interlocking circles. In fact, it's just 4 concentric circles. It can be said that the rich tapestry of visual experience that we cognize, to get a little bit poetic, is actually an internal composite presented by our senses and subsequently organized by the internal algorithms used by our brains to interpret and give rise to meaningful perceptions. Psychologists call this process our habits of perception. There are people, aside from psychologists, who make it their business to understand these habits of perception. They understand how we are used to seeing things, and they know how we expect to see things. And they use that knowledge to create for us realities that don't really exist. Anybody know the kind of person I'm talking about here? Magicians. Not that long ago in the course, someone suggested politicians. I think that's another very good answer to the question. This phenomenon, according to neuroscientists Stephen Macknick and Susanna Martinez-Conde, authors of a very interesting book called Sleights of Mind, is an unavoidable result born of the sheer limitations in the number of neurons and neural connections underlying our sensory and mental processes. What they're saying is the human brain, as powerful as it is, still doesn't have enough computing power to do a full 100% mapping of the environmental cues in a particular space. By the way, I recommend this book. It's a fun and entertaining book to read. They get into the neuroscience of magic. Spoiler alert, though, they do reveal how a number of very well-known magic tricks are done. We're accustomed to the notion that our perception of reality, of what is out there, is accurate, but this simply is not true. For example, here we see what appears to be three very well formed rows of text. All the letters seem to be exactly the same height. The three rows all appear to be perfectly lined up. Yet if we shift where we're standing by a few feet, suddenly things don't look quite so well formed. In fact, they actually look pretty distorted. Here, the context of what we see depends on where we stand. Our visual circuits are not passive transmitters of sensory input, but actively amplify, suppress, converge, and diverge all incoming visual information, to use the author's own words. They go further and assert you perceive what you see as something different from reality. Perception means resolving ambiguity. They provide another great example that we're all very familiar with. Why does the full moon look so big when it first rises over the horizon? Whereas when we see it high up in the sky, it appears to be much smaller. The discrepancy in perceived size is primarily due to the influence of visual context. Down near the horizon, adjacent to hills, trees, buildings, telephone poles, whatever, our brain actually enlarges the size of the lunar disk that we see based on these environmental or contextual cues. But high up in the sky, with only the vastness of the overhead sky to provide context, our visual circuits actually reduce its perceived size. Now, full disclosure here, if you measure the size of the full moon down near the horizon and then measure it again high up in the sky, it will measure a little bit bigger down near the horizon due to the effects of something called atmospheric lensing. But the difference is pretty minimal. It's only a couple of percent, and it's not something you'd normally notice. So again, the difference that you do see is primarily because of context. Which size is true? Well, it's kind of hard to say. These are just a few examples of how our perception is not as static as we believe it to be, but is a dynamic process sensitive to the environmental cues surrounding visual input. Furthermore, scientists have been able to categorize what we would recognize as attention, our ability to direct our focus, not as a single and uniform phenomenon, but as a number of discrete cognitive processes. Of particular relevance to environmental design and the mechanics involved in how we experience a given space is the cognitive phenomenon known as the spotlight of attention, the ability to regulate sensory input by bearing down onto a particular region of visual space, while at the same time tuning out data or stimuli that fall outside that tunnel vision of focus. This isn't limited to just our vision. Some of you may have heard of something called the cocktail party effect. We can be in a room with 50 other people, all having conversations between themselves, and we have the ability to pick out, follow, and understand a single conversation between two people in that room while tuning out all the other conversations. When we direct our focus to a given area, our spotlight of attention falls on what is called retinotopic space. As Macknick and Martinez-Conde explain, neurons from higher levels of your visual system increase the activation of the low-level circuits and enhance their sensitivity to sensory input. At the same time, neurons in the surrounding regions of visual space are actively inhibited. I think this same process probably also explains what my wife refers to as my selective hearing. It's interesting to note that another neuroscientist, Dr. Steve Rose, author of The Future of the Brain, notes a fascinating study where the perceived sensory input actually increases when the context changes. That is, the same visual stimulus presented under a different context does in fact lead to a more, or sometimes less, engaging cognitive experience. Dr. Rose believes that this is the stuff of which unexpected illusions are made. In one of his, in one of his lectures discussing his book, Dr. Rose wonders what is wrong with the world around us, considering that clinical depression has become the malaise of contemporary humanity. Considering what we now know about the importance of multisensory stimuli and environmental context, Dr. Rose asks the question, could the unprecedented global spike in clinical depression have an architectural origin? Kind of a profound question. Could the lack of a neurologically complex environment, which is the hallmark of visual access to nature, coupled with the wholesale migration to static artificial interiors that provide little sensory stimuli, be largely responsible for this dramatic change in modern humanity's psychological well-being and even our neural chemistry? Instead of living and working in natural environments, a substantial percentage of the population labors within intricate labyrinth-like buildings in high-density metropolitan areas. Nothing really could be further disassociated from our innate biophilic need for open space. The healing canopy of open skies, one of the circadian synchronizers that help entrain or reset our circadian rhythm, is the spatial connection that artificial interiors must account for if they're to support occupants who spend the majority of their workday within their walls. When our senses are immersed in a natural environment, we experience what's called biophilic engagement. Our physiology relaxes while our mind remains alert. This is known as the automatic relaxation response. It's the opposite of the fight or flight response and every bit as instinctual. When we're stressed and fatigued, our productivity plummets, and enclosed interiors have been found to magnify stress, anxiety, and fatigue. To alleviate these symptoms, we must learn how to elicit that biophilic engagement in confined artificial environments. While cognition itself is a complex subject, it's enough to note that human spatial cognition is fundamental to human life. By spatial cognition, neuroscientists Roger Hart and Gary Moore refer to the internalized reflection and reconstruction of space in thought. Over the past approximately 30 years, the field of evidence-based design has taken a prominent role in studying the environmental features most conducive to a healing environment, building a knowledge base during that time that now guides architectural design in healthcare settings. For any of you who may not be familiar with the term evidence-based design, what that means, and again, this will be a bit of a simplification, but what that means is scientifically and rigorously studying which environmental features in a particular space may adversely affect or negatively impact patient recovery, healing, and wellness, and which features may positively affect or promote patient recovery, healing, and wellness. And then trying to include as many of the positive features while minimizing the negative features, at least to the maximum extent practical. Again, that's a bit of a simplification, but that's evidence-based design in a nutshell. During this period, healthcare researchers and designers have embraced the benefits of nature art imagery in providing what are called positive distraction features in clinical settings. When somebody goes to the hospital, frequently they're stressed. They feel bad. They don't know why. That's why they're going to see the doctor. Or maybe they do know why. Maybe they've been told that they have cancer or some other horrible disease. It's been found that views of nature, whether an actual view out through a real window or nature photography, or even just nature-inspired art, can give those patients something that they can put their attention on to distract them, if you will, from whatever it is that they're stressing about. Interestingly enough, though, until fairly recently, neither the designers of nature art imagery nor the researchers involved in documenting the clinical properties of nature art have considered the cognitive implications of introducing a more profound phenomenon, that of visual illusions, into healthcare settings. Virtual skylights are such visual illusions. When properly designed, they give rise to a powerful architectural tool. Again, what we refer to as biophilic illusions of nature that incorporate materials and techniques ranging from art and photography to filmmaking and architecture. Taken together, they become an artistic tool and a unique image technology that can engage our cognitive organs in such a way that our hardwired habits of perception experience something else. It's almost like they can transport us out of that enclosed interior space. They're able to induce a restorative experience of biophilic engagement in enclosed interior spaces. Such a visual design framework would need to factor how we process multisensory stimuli. Unlike standard commercial photography, which does not require any kind of context, images that are designed as visual illusions reinforce the environmental context of their surroundings, an attribute that permits them to engage spatial cognition. Imagery that incorporates an architectural context triggers a deeper therapeutic response, not just psychological, but a broader neurophysiological response to the perceived change in the surroundings. Illusions of natural environments lead the observer's physiology to experience a visceral sensation of openness that can and does have meaningful restorative benefits. After several years of noting recurrent patient experiences of vastness, that is, a palpable sensation of openness, when exposed to biophilic illusions in enclosed clinical environments, it became evident that looking into the neuroarchitecture of how such illusions are perceived could be very illuminating. A few years ago, Texas Tech University's College of Human Sciences and their Neuroimaging Institute spearheaded a study that was subsequently published in the peer-reviewed academic journal, Health, Environments, Research, and Design. The Texas Tech study was designed to uncover the neural pathways involved in the perception of open sky photographic compositions as compared to how other kinds of images are perceived. What the researchers did for this study, they used a technology called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, to map electrical activity in the brains of test subjects as they were shown a series of different photographs. Some of the images were selected to evoke a positive emotional response in the brain and activate those areas of the brain known to neuroscience for processing positive content. Pictures of butterflies, puppies, kittens, other cute animals, and pleasant nature scenes. Some of the photographs were selected to evoke a negative emotional response and activate those areas of the brain known to process negative content. Different brain areas, interestingly enough. These were pictures of forest fires, garbage dumps, ugly insects, dead animals. Some of the images were selected not to evoke any kind of an emotional response at all, close-up of a sheet of plywood or a brick wall. and some of the images were carefully composed open sky photographic compositions. This study actually earned Best International Research Project of 2014 at the Design and Health International Academy Awards for shedding light on the neuroarchitecture of functional illusions of nature. And in 2017, the study also earned a Certificate of Research Excellence, or CORE Award, from the Environmental Design Research Association. Two actually quite prestigious awards. The award-winning study revealed that specifically designed open sky photographic compositions can be deliberately framed not only to share the same characteristic neural activations present in positive images. Again, these are nature images known to elicit a positive emotional response in the brain, but also to engage areas of the brain involved in spatial cognition. And of particular interest to the researchers were activations they found in the cerebellum, as it's normally associated with aspects of moving through space and depth perception. This was surprising. Never before had the researchers seen activity in the cerebellum when showing people static, unmoving two-dimensional photographs, something new. The positive impact of nature images on health outcomes has been traditionally measured using behavioral and physiological indicators, which has left much to be understood about the neural mechanisms that explain their positive influence. The Texas Tech study was a step towards such understanding. There's actually a lot of ongoing research, not just at Texas Tech, but at many other universities all around the world on this topic. So with a neurological understanding of the power that biophilic illusions have to alter perceived space in enclosed interiors, indoor spaces can leverage a research-based approach to mitigate the deleterious impact of deep plan buildings. With such tools, isolated areas can be adapted to provide healthy, biophilic, and restorative interiors for human occupancy. There's growing interest in studying biophilic illusions to pinpoint how they mitigate the consequences of spending lots of time in an enclosed interior space. These illusions emerge from a combination of different environmental cues. Among these are the quality of the reproduced visual content, that is, how good is that photograph? The seamless integration of visual elements into an appropriate architectural context, whether that be something that looks like it might be part of a skylight, as you see here, to maybe a backlit landscape photograph that's been recessed into the wall a little bit and then surrounded by what looks like a window frame, maybe even with some shades or blinds, and the manipulation of light intensity and color temperature, which all collectively combine to synthesize a new perception of space. In situations when an interior space cannot incorporate an actual visual connection to nature, we can mimic the geometry of natural environments by reproducing two fundamental spatial relationships within the architectural framework of interior spaces. The first of these spatial relationships is the perceived zenith. That is the point going straight up above the observer's head, where they perceive the space that they occupy to end. When we're inside, that's going to be the ceiling plane, typically a few feet to maybe a few tens of feet above our heads. When we're outside, it's generally much, much higher. Tree branches, clouds, the sky. The other of these spatial relationships is the perceived horizon line. That's the point going straight out in front of us, farthest away, where we perceive the sky to meet the ground or the sea. In any environment, inside or outside, natural or artificial, the zenith and the horizon line serve as environmental anchors that shape our experience of space. We cannot underestimate the importance of visual input and spatial awareness to our well-being. When we have our eyes open, vision accounts for 2/3 of the entire electrical activity of the brain, a full 2 billion of the 3 billion total neural firings every second. In fact, more than 50% of all the neural tissue in our bodies is directly or indirectly related to vision. Both our frontal vision as well as our peripheral vision work together to automatically map out the space we occupy. But our psychophysiological relationship to space is much more than a simple mechanical mapping function. Environmental psychologists have suggested that human beings perceive a strong relationship between the space that surrounds them and the passage of time. Research has found that larger spaces tend to slow perceived time, whereas smaller spaces tend to speed up perceived time. This relationship reveals some interesting dynamics, and it may in part explain why deadlines seem so much more looming while we're sitting at our desks. We're in a relatively small space, our perception of time speeds up, we start getting very anxious that we're not going to have enough time to finish whatever it is that we're working on. When we feel our body, which is our entrained measure of scale, to be smaller in relation to the space we occupy, we literally perceive time to slow down. This has been observed clinically, and it echoes the scale proportions found in views to nature that offer something called prospect and refuge. That is, where we have unimpeded visual and spatial access out into some expansive environment from a small secure spot like a balcony or a secluded outlook. Given this recurrent scale relationship, it's not surprising that panoramic views of nature remain a hallmark of ideal aesthetic design. Some neuroscientists, like Jennifer Groh, who we talked about earlier, speculate that abstract thought is intimately linked to spatial cognition, and the way we map out our sense of space may also be responsible for the very nature of human thought itself. Another very profound insight, I think. In her book, Making Space, How the Brain Knows Where Things Are, Dr. Groh asserts that much of the information stored in our memory systems is intrinsically spatial. We find things by remembering where to look, and many of the brain's sensory and motor regions also exhibit memory-related activity. She goes on to remark that the parietal cortex, another part of the brain in that same hypothalamus region, the parietal cortex seems to play a role in unlocking memories by calling to mind spatial frame references based on one's imagined perspective on the scene. She goes on to provide an interesting example from a study that was done back during the 1970s by a couple of Italian researchers who tested patients who suffered from damage to one side or the other of their parietal cortex on how well they could recall familiar settings. The researchers asked their patients to imagine themselves standing at the foot of the famous Piazza del Duomo in Milan, Italy, and to name as many landmarks from around the square as they could. They found that the patients had trouble naming landmarks from the side of the square corresponding to the damaged part of their parietal cortex. The really interesting discovery came when the researchers asked their patients to switch mental perspectives and now imagine themselves standing at the opposite end of the square, facing back the opposite direction. The change in vantage point, even though it was only imagined, now allowed those patients to remember landmarks from the side of the square that they previously couldn't. So those memories were actually there all along. Conscious access to these memories was only a matter of recreating the proper spatial frame reference in the mind's eye of the patients. Interesting study. In similar fashion, when we create visual stimuli in enclosed interiors with the proper spatial frame reference, and again, that's a design element that's unique to illusions of nature and not found in standard decorative photography, we're able to reestablish a neural connection to our past experiences of looking up at the sky. These neural dynamics indicate the central role that spatial reference frames play in channeling stored biophilic memories of spatially similar experiences. And it may also explain why even a relatively small simulated skylight inside of a building can also evoke the same relaxation response that open natural environments so easily reveal. Furthermore, recent research has identified additional brain areas related to spatial mapping are also involved. The parahippocampal place area, or PPA, and the retrospatial cortex, or RSC, both enhance our navigation through familiar environments by drawing upon past spatial memories. This evidence indicates that effective illusions may also trigger additional brain areas related to spatial mapping that could lead to a more complete picture of how previously experienced environments can enable illusory perceptions to remap actual space in the present. These assertions provide a neurological basis to understand why natural environments have played such a fundamental role in the development of our neural circuitry, and why now, more than ever, when urban humankind's daily experience is one of limited built space rather than natural open space, the negative consequences to our cognitive functions, like performance and wellness, cannot be stressed enough. With the modern march toward limited disconnected space, society has seen the rise of urban pathologies, most notably hypertension, chronic stress, and attention deficit affective disorder. It's interesting to note, though, these acquired behaviors all tend to lose much of their neurotic hold when the subject is immersed in a larger spatial frame of reference. In the case of interior spaces, we can extend the interior zenith using a multisensory illusion that passes through the ceiling plane. We can establish a perceived zenith beyond the ceiling. Such an illusory zenith not only provides visual information, but it also engages our vestibular system, thereby incorporating our sense of balance and spatial orientation to reinforce the new spatial reference frame. A multisensory approach to image composition, among other elements of design, is fundamental to creating a successful illusion. The combined environmental cues tie the overhead image to its architectural context, thereby making the boundaries of the ceiling transparent, if you will, to both the eye and the awareness of the observer. The suggestive quality of the environmental cues, image composition, and light quality, all married to an appropriate architectural context, can similarly weaken the boundaries of interior walls. So in summary, these two spatial relationships, the perceived zenith and the perceived horizon line, together represent a new visual and cognitive technology that's just begun to be leveraged in deep plan interiors. It's particularly useful when other avenues to bring biophilic design relief indoors are not structurally possible or economically feasible. By taking this cognitive framework into account in the visual design process, it's possible to have a research-based visual technology that can be used to transform literally billions of square feet of enclosed interiors into comfortable, healthy, and restorative spaces that are much better suited for long-term human occupancy. Okay, I told you guys it was going to be informationally dense. I'd like to take just a quick 2 minutes to talk very briefly about our company and what we do. We started our company, Sky Factory, 18 years ago, specifically to create these illusions of nature in the form of virtual skylights and virtual windows. We can do basically any size, any shape that you want to design of skylight. We can do custom grid patterns. We have several different styles of sky ceiling. Some work with a suspended grid ceiling system. Others can be installed directly into hard ceilings. We have skylights where there's actually some parallax. When you move around, you can see more or less of the clouds around the edges. We last year set up a partnership with Armstrong Ceiling systems. You can now incorporate our Skylights into Armstrong's Axiom cloud systems. Later this year, we'll be introducing a dynamic lighting system, so the intensity and the color will shift through the day. Healthcare is by far our biggest market. Medical imaging, dental, senior living is another great application, hospital waiting rooms. We've done some educational projects. We've done some retail projects. We've even done some residential projects. We have a companion product for the wall, simulated windows, we call luminous virtual windows. And by using something called red digital cinema technology, we actually have products where the imagery can move and in some cases even have sound. This is a moving image window. It has the actual sounds of nature. We have a moving image aquarium, a fish tank that'll never leak. You don't have to pay anyone to come clean it, no dead floaters, and it weighs less than a real tank. I invite you to visit our website. On our product pages, you'll find tech specs, guide specs, installation instructions, CAD and Revit files. We have a portfolio page with hundreds of photos of actual installations, give you ideas of what we can do. And on our education page, you'll find a white paper that you can download. It's what the course was derived from, with a full set of footnotes and references to all of the books, articles, studies, and publications I talked about in the course. If you're interested in any further reading, visit our education page, download that white paper, and follow those references. Okay, with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we'll take a look at what questions have come in.
Awesome, thank you. That was really interesting, Jeff. We do have a couple questions that have come in, and the first one is, does the research indicate that a person's age makes a difference in the circadian perceptor's ability to perceive? And what about the color of the iris?
Interesting question. That's one that I have not been asked before, and I don't know. I will see what I can find out about that, though. Whether age has an effect on perception, that's a very fascinating question. Intuitively, I would think that it may, although I'm not sure how it would. You know, the older you get, the more of these past experiences you have. So it may turn out that the older we get, the easier it is to create a credible illusion to fool our perception. But that's just speculation on my part right now. As to whether the color of the iris has any effect, again, an interesting question. I don't know. Great, thank you for asking that.
And I had a question kind of inspired by that previous one. I had a roommate in grad school who was colorblind, and so I was curious how that changes the perception of these visual images if they can't distinguish some of those colors.
Another interesting question. And no one's asked me that one before either. Again, intuitively, I would think, you know, someone who is colorblind has some deficiency in how they see colors. That's going to affect how they see real nature scenes, the same way it's likely to affect how they would see our illusions. So my gut feeling, my inclination would be that it probably isn't going to affect them much. However they see nature with whatever color deficiency they may have, they tend to see our illusions the same way. So I would think it wouldn't affect it much. But again, I've definitely got some research I'm going to do. Great questions.
Pure curiosity. It was funny. He would always come out with like mismatched plaid, and my roommate and I would send him back and be like, try again, a different shirt. Okay, is there any research on the is there any research that shows the biophilic design has ability to heal?
There is actually. About 6 years ago, our company, Sky Factory, we sponsored some research, another study that was done by Texas Tech in conjunction with Covenant Health Systems in Texas. And what they did is Covenant had some post-surgical recovery facilities. One such facility had 10 post-operative recovery rooms. And we gave them 5 small simulated skylights. I think they were 2 feet by 4 feet each. And they put them in 5 of those recovery rooms. The other 5 rooms had just plain acoustic tile ceilings. And what they found was a very statistically significant reduction in the use of pain medication from the patients who were in the rooms with the simulated skylights. They also tended to heal faster. And if the surgery was a major invasive surgery, typically they could be discharged a full day before the other patients who were in rooms without the sky ceiling. So there has been that study, and there are other studies that have been done which all support the claim that views of nature, either actual or simulated, do have a fairly profound effect on patient recovery.
Fascinating. I think we've got one more question here, and it is there any research examining any diminishing positive impact resulting in the repeated exposure to the same photograph? For example, will it have the same impact after you've been using the same conference room for 3 years?
Great question. I don't know if there's been any formal studies to that effect, but as I mentioned earlier, we've been in business for over 18 years now. When we had been in business for about 12 years, so about 6 years ago, we ran a special promotion. We contacted all of our customers at the time, and at that time we had sold maybe 8,000 simulated skylights. We contacted all of those customers and offered them a replacement set of image panels at half price. We had one customer take us up on that. Most of the other customers told us, nah, we love those we still love the imagery. We love our sky ceilings. Again, most of our business is into healthcare. And most of the installations go into areas that typically are frequented by patients. You know, MRI rooms, other imaging rooms, cancer treatment, kidney dialysis, waiting rooms, places like that. But we have done some installations in areas where the staff spends time, like nurses' stations and things like that. And again, even after several years, those customers still tell us that they're extremely happy. They're delighted with it. With our window products, interestingly though, probably a full third of those customers do buy additional image panels. Those products are designed so it's very easy. It's less than a minute to change out the image in one of our static image windows. And about a third of our customers, 35% maybe, have purchased additional image panels. Most commonly, they'll get sets of 4, one for each season, and they'll change them out appropriately when the seasons change. But otherwise, you know, people seem to be real happy with, especially their skylight images ongoingly. Good question.
Great, thank you.
You're very welcome.
This was so great. I'm sorry to cut off. That was my, you read my mind. I was wondering if it's in the winter and you're looking at a summer season, do you get fooled? Is that enough magic? This has been a great presentation. Thank you.
You bet, Suzanne. Hey, I just want to mention in regard to what you just said, the University of Oregon is actually doing a study. It's a joint effort between their departments of architecture and psychology, and they're looking at things like seasonal appropriateness and weather appropriateness and geographical appropriateness, and how those things affect the strength or the credibility of the illusion. One thing that we've found is that most people are able to recognize that our products are simulated. It's not really a skylight, it's not really a window, it's a simulated view. And it's kind of like, you know, if you go see a magician, you know he didn't really just cut his assistant in half with a chainsaw. While he's doing the trick though, it's very engaging. Similarly, people can recognize it is a simulated view of the sky. And even though they know that intellectually, the illusion is so strong that their body responds physiologically very similar to how it would to an actual view of the sky or view out of a window. Thank you for that comment.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if you didn't see it at the top of the screen is the form Jeff sent me for you all to fill out to receive credit. Please, I just dropped it in there again. Please make sure you do fill that out. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to put you in touch with Jeff. All right. And with that, thank you all. And
thanks, everyone. I really appreciate, again, your time and interest today. I hope you all have a great afternoon, and please stay healthy, safe, and sane in these rather insane times we all have found ourselves living in. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Likewise. Thanks, Jeff.